It was a bright Saturday afternoon in the small town of Birchwood. Located in the heart of the Midwest, the local grocery store, an essential hub for the community, hummed with the usual sounds of shoppers exchanging pleasantries and collecting items for their weekly needs. The shelves were well stocked, and the aisles were filled with the hum of carts rolling across the floor. People milled about, going about their everyday tasks, making the occasional small talk about the weather or what they planned for dinner. On this day, however, the usual hum of normalcy would soon be interrupted by an incident that would shift the energy in the store entirely. At the far end of the produce section stood an elderly woman, Betty Johnson, who seemed to be having trouble selecting the perfect head of lettuce. Her silver hair was neatly tucked under a scarf, and she wore a faded floral dress that spoke of a simpler time. Despite her appearance, Betty carried herself with a sharpness that suggested a strong-willed character. Her glasses perched on the tip of her nose, and she muttered softly to herself as she sifted through the vegetables, visibly frustrated. Meanwhile, Jamar Wright, a young black man in his mid-20s, strolled down the same aisle. Dressed in a gray hoodie and jeans, Jamar was just another ordinary shopper. He had his phone in one hand and a basket in the other as he moved toward the apples. But as he reached for the fruit, something unexpected happened. Betty's attention was drawn to Jamar, and the look in her eyes shifted immediately. With a sudden shift in her demeanor, Betty turned sharply toward Jamar, her gaze narrowing. It was as if something had triggered a change in her, and what had been a quiet, personal moment for her now became one of confrontation. "You don't belong here," Betty said loudly, her words sharp enough to draw the attention of nearby shoppers. Jamar, taken aback, paused, his hand still hovering over a basket of apples. He slowly lifted his gaze to meet Betty's eyes, unsure if he had heard her correctly. Without missing a beat, Betty continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "Why don't you go back to where you came from?" she spat, her words hanging in the air. The atmosphere in the store instantly thickened. Nearby customers froze, their eyes widening in disbelief as the usual sounds of shopping came to a halt. The store, which had been filled with casual chatter, was now eerily quiet, all attention directed toward the confrontation unfolding in the produce section. Jamar remained still, his thoughts racing. Should he respond? Should he leave? His face remained calm, but inside, his mind was spinning. He stood tall, his posture never wavering as he locked eyes with Betty. His grip on the basket tightened, and the weight of the moment pressed on him. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady and low, though it carried a clear intensity. "Ma'am," he said, "do you even hear what you're saying?" Betty's frustration was palpable, and she snapped back. "I said what I said. This is my country. People like you don't belong here." The words landed like a slap to the face, and a few people in the crowd exchanged uncomfortable looks. A woman with a small child quickly moved down the aisle, pulling her son away from the tense situation. But Jamar didn't flinch. He remained rooted to the spot, the weight of his family's history seeming to settle on his shoulders like a cloak. "I see," Jamar said slowly, his voice unwavering. "Let's talk about that, since you brought it up." The people around them held their breath. Everyone in the aisle turned their attention to Jamar, waiting for what he would say next. He set his basket gently on the floor, not in anger, but with deliberate calm. His presence seemed to command the attention of the room. He turned to Betty fully, not with anger, but with a quiet strength that made her uncomfortable. "You say I don't belong here," Jamar continued, his voice growing stronger, "but let me tell you about where I come from." The silence was absolute, the only sound being Jamar's words. He paused for a moment to collect his thoughts. His words began to fall like stones dropped into a still pond, the ripples of his speech filling the room with a quiet power. "My great-grandfather was born in the South, in Alabama," Jamar began. "He worked as a farmer, picking cotton just to survive. His father? He was born into slavery. Didn't even have a name at first, just a number. A piece of property. Nothing more." Jamar's voice grew stronger with every word, each sentence carrying more weight and more truth. The customers in the aisle, who had once been stunned into silence, were now listening intently. "My grandfather served in the military, fought in a war across the world," Jamar continued, "only to come back and be treated like dirt. He couldn't sit at the same lunch counter as white people, couldn't drink from the same water fountains. But he stayed here. He stayed, Because he believed in the promise of this country. Even when this country didn't believe in him. The crowd around them shifted. Eyes now locked on Jamar as he spoke with a calm power. He wasn't angry, he was sharing his truth. My parents fought too, Jamar added, his voice softer now, not with weapons, but with dignity. My mother's a nurse. She spent decades caring for anyone who needed her, no matter their race. My father's a mechanic, a man who would drop everything to help a stranger in need. Betty was silent now, her hands trembling as she clutched the handle of her cart. She couldn't respond. She didn't know what to say. Jamar took a step closer. His voice calm, but ringing through the store. You told me to go back to where I came from. He said quietly. Well, ma'am, I'm here because my family built this country. We've paid the price through hardship and sacrifice. The woman's face grew pale as she held on tightly to her cart. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Jamar took a step back, his voice rising slightly as he addressed the entire store. I could have walked away, he said, but walking away doesn't fix anything. Silence won't end hate. It's up to all of us to speak up, to be better. The room seemed to exhale collectively. The tension that had once filled the store seemed to dissipate, replaced with a sense of clarity. A man near the frozen food section cleared his throat and spoke up. You're right, man, he said, nodding. We have to be better than this. A woman, who had been quietly listening nearby, added, my grandfather fought in that same war. He always said the only thing that matters is what's inside. One by one, people began to voice their support. A young cashier called out from the back of the store. I've never seen anyone respond so calmly to something like that. Thank you. Betty, now visibly shaken, didn't meet anyone's eyes. She turned and started to push her cart toward the door. But the fire that had been in her earlier words had been extinguished. She walked away, her head lowered. As Betty left, a few people approached Jamar, their faces full of respect. One woman placed a hand on his shoulder. You did good, she said softly. Jamar smiled, though his expression remained heavy. I didn't do it for praise, he replied. I did it because we all deserve better than this. With that, the store slowly returned to normal. The hum of shopping, the chatter between customers, and the sounds of carts resumed as life continued. But for those who had witnessed the encounter, Jamar's words would linger long after the doors had closed. Jamar's calm, measured response had sparked something in the room. It was more than just a confrontation, it was a reminder of the power of words, the strength of character, and the responsibility that everyone has to stand up against hate. The elderly woman, though not apologizing, was left to face the discomfort of her own words. Meanwhile, the people in the store, who had once been passive observers, found the courage to speak up against prejudice. Jamar had shown everyone that it wasn't about the loudest voices, but those who chose to respond with dignity, empathy, and truth. And in that moment, the grocery store had become a microcosm of what could happen when hate was confronted. Even in the most ordinary of places. That day, the grocery store became more than just a place where people shopped, it became a symbol of change. A simple encounter between a young man and an elderly woman had turned into a powerful reminder of humanity's potential for growth and transformation. The strength that Jamar had displayed, with grace and dignity, had left a lasting impression not only on Betty but also on everyone who had been present. His words had shown them the value of empathy and respect, and the importance of standing up for what was right. For Jamar, the moment was a turning point. It wasn't just about confronting prejudice in a store. It was about realizing the power of his voice and the responsibility he carried to create positive change. And for Betty, though she left the store in silence, the words Jamar had spoken that day would stay with her for a long time. She would never again be able to see the world in the same way. As the store returned to its usual rhythm, the power of Jamar's words lingered in the air. It wasn't just a moment of confrontation, but a turning point, both for those who had witnessed it and for Jamar himself. His quiet strength, rooted in the legacy of his ancestors, had opened hearts and minds, reminding everyone that change begins with a single, courageous voice. The story, though small in the grand scheme of things, proved that standing up against prejudice can spark transformation, one person at a time.